Friends, thanks for making time for yet another Texas Public Policy Foundation weekly live stream policy primer. I'm Kevin Roberts, Executive Director of the Foundation, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you. Each week, it seems that we have a larger and larger audience because of the topics that we're covering. And it is difficult to make a joke about the gravity, the seriousness of the issue that we're talking about today. It's always been timely, that is election integrity. For thousands of years, election integrity has been important to humans and to those of us who, of course, appreciate the American tradition of honesty in elections. It is of particular import today because one side of the American political spectrum is using the current crisis in which we find ourselves to amplify their longstanding calls to mail-in ballots. And I know many of you are tuning in to understand the problem with mail-in balloting because it's been in the news. Many of you are tuning in because you understand the problem that was already facing America, and Texas in particular, when it comes to election integrity. So we have with us today three experts, three scholars, three leaders in this fight. I will introduce them in turn, and you are in for a real treat because by the end of this hour, during which, of course, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions of your own by typing them into the comments box, you will know what a problem election integrity is going to be if we sit on our hands this year. So with that, let me introduce our guests today, with three of them, as I mentioned. The first is Jason Snead, who's the Executive Director of the Honest Elections Project. Jason is considered one of the nation's leading experts on election integrity. He served for several years at our wonderful partner, the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., holds a master's in public policy from George Mason and a bachelor's from Bowling Green State University. Jason, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
In addition, my colleague Chuck DeVore from the Texas Public Policy Foundation, our Vice President of National Initiatives. Chuck was a several-term California assemblyman and came to his senses and moved east to Texas. He's one of those Californians we're very happy to have here in Texas and serves TPPF very admirably, serving often on live stream primers because he is a policy expert in many arenas, including this one on which he has done significant research. Chuck, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
And one of our newest TPPF colleagues, former Congressman Quico Canseco, who is of course, a veteran of Congress and a veteran of many policy battles, including the issue of election integrity. Quico has worked with TPPF for a few months now and is leading our election integrity unit. And so our first question will go to you, former Congressman, but before I get to that, thanks so much for joining us and thanks for joining the TPPF team. So Quico, first question is just the basic one. As some friends around the Hill Country and the Austin area were asking me about this event today, even those who were conservative politically said, Kevin, what's the problem with mail-in balloting? They're really trying to understand that something that seems so innocuous might in fact not be.
Well, there is indeed a problem. Mail-in balloting as it is, even before this coronavirus came around, you had problems where people would play it. And it's so playable because there's no voter ID. You can request a mail-in ballot, but it doesn't guarantee that the same person that requested the ballot is the person voting it, or whether the person supposedly requesting the ballot is a true person or a duplicate or somebody else. Additionally, there is no way of proving the statements that are contained in the request for the mail-in ballot. So many people under Texas law, you have to be 65 or older, and unless you're military or incarcerated, you can claim a disability. And not everybody can claim a disability. I mean, you can have crutches, but yet be mobile enough to get to the polls and vote and exercise your right. But because of that, many scratch off the box that says, I cannot, I'm an invalid, or I have a disability and can't go. So there's no way of checking that. And as I'm sure that Chuck DeVore here will probably back up here, but a lot of his research has showed that you have an enormous amount of people that are under 65 that are claiming a disability when, you know, logic tells you otherwise. So it is very vulnerable to fraud and abuse. And additionally, I might add that in my experience, even before the changes in the Texas voter by mail law that happened 2 years ago, you still had a lot of people that were experienced in abusing it going way back. And I can talk about one case in particular where I, as a lawyer, represented a state rep candidate who lost by a mere 200 or so votes in the '04 election. And what we did was that the polls that we've been running showed that he was going to win overwhelmingly. And as it turned out, when we went to all these counties to check their mail-in ballots, most of them on their face showed fraud and abuse. So the dangers of it are that it is so susceptible to fraud and abuse that it instills the huge questions into the viability of an all mail-in ballot, even though seemingly to honest people, it says, well, that's a simple solution and a very convenient one. But no, it's not. All it does is invites more people to abuse it.
Right. And I think that's what's hard for honest folks, regardless of their political persuasion, right? They're honest people across the political spectrum, to understand that this just seems so innocuous, this practice of mail-in balloting, and what a tremendous solution for the situation we're in 2020. But that's just not the case. And so there are rules and laws surrounding this in Texas and every other state. And it's on that topic, Jason, that I want to turn to you about and just ask you to give our audience a summary of what those mail-in balloting rules and laws are in Texas and some key other states.
So right now, all 50 states have an absentee ballot process in effect. And the key distinction between what I'll say are two categories of states in this space are whether or not you require some sort of an excuse. So for instance, Texas's disability statute or an age limit in order to request an absentee ballot, or whether anyone can request an absentee ballot. Right now, there are, I believe, 16 states that have an excuse requirement, and the remainder plus the District of Columbia have a no excuse absentee balloting process in effect. Now, absentee balloting is different from the vote by mail sort of an election, which we're talking about increasingly, in which folks on the political left are advocating for right now in several key ways. One is that with absentee balloting, individual voters have an obligation first to be registered, obviously, but then secondly, to request an absentee vote. So there is no automatic mailing process. The voter has to in some way signify that they intend to vote absentee and request a ballot be sent to them. And a second is that there are a number of, we'll call them voter identification requirements, but really ballot verification procedures that are baked into the absentee balloting process. And what we can get to a little bit later is how all of these are right now under siege, either through litigation or legislation. And these particular procedures include one of the most commonplace, which is a signature matching requirement. This is where a voter signs the ballot and that signature is compared to a signature on file for that voter. And if there appears to be a mismatch, then the ballot is flagged. And in some states, there's an opportunity for the voter to cure by coming in and testing that they are who they say they are, or else otherwise the ballot is disqualified and not counted. Other procedures that are in place in various states include in about 10 states, the requirement that there be at least one, sometimes two witnesses who will sign the ballot along with the voter, attesting that the individual filling out the ballot is in fact the qualified voter that they say they are. Or in one state, there's a requirement that the ballot be notarized. In effect, a notary then steps in and assumes the mantle of responsibility for verifying that the voter is in fact who they say they are. So there are these processes baked into the absentee ballot voting process, which are key to ensuring the credibility of an absentee vote. But in the vote by mail process, and again, we can touch on this a little bit more in depth, in the vote by mail process, most of these running down the list are undermined or significantly curtailed. And there's ongoing litigation in Texas and elsewhere seeking to undermine, for instance, signature matching requirements, seeking to ensure that absentee ballots get sent automatically to all voter registrations on file, even if those voters are presumed to have died or moved away and no longer obviously be able to vote. So those are some key distinctions in place right now between absentee balloting processes that are in effect and the direction that folks want us to go.
Thanks, Jason, for that excellent summary. So, Chuck, I want to bring you into this conversation, and although we'll have probably a few questions about some of the research you've done that's Texas specific, just sort of first blush, most important summary you would give about this particular problem in Texas right now.
Well, this problem in Texas is a long time in coming. What you see historically is every election cycle, you're seeing greater and greater use of mail-in balloting. That in itself shouldn't be an issue. It is an important tool in a winning campaign. However, statistics would seem to indicate that what we're seeing in Texas is a very large increase in the number of people under the age of 65 requesting mail-in ballots, far beyond what you would expect from the standpoint of people who are disabled and not able to easily make it to the polls. And this would suggest statistically that groups are out there encouraging people to request mail-in ballots and either checking the disability box for them or telling them, just go ahead and do it, no one's going to check. The reason why that is important and might be done is that you can guarantee then the vote for your campaign, for your side. It's a way of banking votes. Now, unfortunately, it's also illegal per Texas law. And so our concern is that outside groups, groups that are receiving a lot of money from outside of Texas, are seeing that winning is its own reward, regardless of complying with the law.
Thanks, Chuck. So we'll come back to some of the research that you've done, and as we get a little bit deeper into the conversation, you can forecast some of the research we will be doing. But Quico, I want to go back to you and ask you to speak a little bit about your experience, not just as an elected member of Congress, but really as a candidate, someone who's out on the voter trail, knocking on doors. And I asked this question very innocently: did you encounter evidence of voter fraud?
Absolutely, I did. And I will start out with my youth. When I was a lot younger and practicing law, as a young lawyer, I went to my first jury selection in Border County. And there were about 120 or so veneermen. And the judge first says, under Texas law, you cannot be a convicted felon and you must be a US citizen. So before we continue, I want to take the excuses of anyone who is either a convicted felon or not a citizen. And more than half of the veneermen get up. And at that time, they were taking all of the jurors out of the voting rolls, which tells you that so many people that are not citizens are registered to vote. Now let's go back to my re-election campaign. After redistricting, they had given me a huge strip along the border of almost 100,000 people that were on my voter registration list that I had to go door knocking. And I did. A lot of the people would respond, no, saying, oh, we're not citizens. And I said, well, why is your name here? And they said, well, people come around and ask us some questions, and sometimes they ask us to sign a paper just for our opinion. And door after door after door, those things happen. And then there are empty lots with all these mailboxes, and all these registered voters and families are registered under all these multiple mailboxes on an empty lot. And that was not just one incident, that was a variety of other incidents in other areas. So it is a fallacy to say that there is no voter fraud. It is a fallacy to say that, well, if it happens, it's only minuscule and it's harder to prosecute. It has been growing for a long, long time. And it is now coming to the fore because of this huge push to get a nationwide mail-in ballot through all of our state legislators. Why? Because it is the left's idea that with their experience, having conducted all these fraudulent activities, not that they do it, but people that they can wash their hands clean from saying that they have anything to do with them, do that. And those are the people that know how to game the system and know how to gain an advantage for the people that hire them.
Thanks so much, Quico. So you implied something that I mentioned earlier, which is that, of course, the coronavirus problem is giving those who would advocate for mail-in ballot, perhaps with nefarious purposes, an opportunity to expand their call. And so, Jason, I just want to turn back to you for you to comment on that. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 not being concerned at all and 10 being apoplectic, how concerned should our audience be about these calls to move to an all-mail ballot, as some leaders of the left have suggested?
I think that we ought to be at least at a 9. I'm not sure I want to be apoplectic at this point, but we ought to be extremely concerned about this for a number of reasons. One is just from the practical side of things, the notion that we could retool or reshape something as complicated as our electoral system, which is, after all, effectively 50 different election systems that are then further federated by running them individually at the county level across the country, that we could remake that entire process in about 5 months or so, and move from a primarily in-person election where people go and vote at either a precinct polling place or a vote center on election day, to one in which nearly everyone votes by mail. That idea just doesn't hold water. There are too many practical concerns. States that have done this, that have moved to vote by mail, take far longer than 5 months. And you can talk to their elected officials responsible for that, and they will tell you it is not an easy thing to do. It requires overhauling the entire process. There are, of course, integrity and security concerns associated with this as well. So there is the legislative push right now in Congress to try to mandate a vote by mail election this fall. And this is being promulgated under the guise of a pandemic response. But what we're actually seeing is that the provisions in this legislation are making permanent changes to how elections are run. And they're effectively backdooring a permanent vote by mail with a provision in the latest Democratic House proposal, the HEROES Act, that allows for anyone who requests one absentee ballot to be put on a permanent absentee ballot list. Couple that with what would be statutory limitations on using voter identification for by mail voting, that would put a major loophole in effect for voter identification at the polls, that would legalize ballot harvesting. All of these sorts of efforts to denude election integrity provisions that are being put in place in legislative proposals, that ought to be of a significant concern to your viewers. And then on the litigation, unfortunately, one of the trends that we've seen at each and every election cycle is that more money, more time, and more effort is being pumped into election day or pre-election day litigation. We were anticipating 2020 already would be an historic level of litigation. And what we've seen is that with the coronavirus pandemic, there is a sense of opportunism, I think, that has taken hold on the left. And we are seeing an unprecedented level of litigation in which every single battleground state is being targeted with 2, 3, 4, 5 suits active right now, all of which are trying to undermine voter identification laws, absentee ballot protections, legalized ballot harvesting. If you name it, they are attempting to do it. And the purpose behind, I think, all of this is to, whether it's through legislation or litigation, manipulate the election process to structurally advantage one side at the expense of the other. And that's something that no one of any political stripe should support.
Excellent synopsis, Jason. Thank you. So, Chuck, as we consider the reality here, let me just introduce a devil's advocate question. So for someone who says, okay, I believe you, what the three of you are saying about the problems of mail-in ballot, I might even believe you that, or agree with you that there's some agenda there, and yet I have concerns about my health or the health of, say, a particular segment of Americans when it comes to this November. You've been tracking not just election integrity, but also the reality of the coronavirus. How would you handle that legitimate question from the devil's advocate?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it seems to me a couple of things. First of all, Texas and many other states have provisions for early voting that would allow voters to go to the polls when they're significantly less crowded. Number one. Number two, we see with this virus that particularly people over the age of 65 are particularly vulnerable to the virus. Well, in Texas, good news. If you're 65 and over, that is automatic qualification to ask for a mail-in ballot. So go ask for one, and you'll be able to cast your ballot from the safety of home. And so if we have, in the case of this virus, the people at greatest risk already able to legally vote from home, then it seems to me we're well more than 80% of the way there, with much of the rest then handled by the fact that we have very generous early voting provisions. So I would categorically reject the call and agree with the Texas Attorney General that fear of the virus is not a disability under Texas statute.
Thanks, Chuck. And Quico, I just want to follow up with you regarding the same question, but I was also going to ask you a second question, and that is the important news Friday from the Texas Supreme Court. Some of our viewers saw that in reference to Attorney General Ken Paxton's lawsuit. I'd invite you to speak to that as well before we start kind of looking ahead and examining some solutions to this problem.
Well, I want to add, first of all, to what Chuck said. And add to the idea that I bet you a dime to a donut that anybody that is advocating for an all mail-in ballot has been to the grocery store lately. And they have done a phenomenal job of protecting each and every one of us as we go in. Stay 6 feet apart, wear a mask, need to be, wear gloves. And when you're finished shopping, you are protected from the clerk, and the clerk is protected from you with a whole bunch of plexiglass. If it's good enough for that very, very vital nutrition that every human being needs, then it certainly is important and a great solution for the mail-in ballot people that are complaining that it's the only protection. It's not the only protection. There are a lot of other protection and protection measures. The Supreme Court is really addressing, the Texas Supreme Court is addressing a lawsuit out of Travis County that literally gagged the Attorney General, who is not a party to a lawsuit, and at the same time implied to a lot of other counties around the state of Texas, even though the court in Travis County did not so order, because it had no jurisdiction to so order. Many counties are taking that Travis County decision to mean that the whole state of Texas was going into an all mail-in ballot, saying that you can check off the box that says that you have a disability and therefore you are entitled to a mail-in ballot, even though you can walk to the polls, even though you're not sick, even though you're under 65, but yet you have fear of getting the virus. And what the Supreme Court did, I think over the weekend or late Friday, was stayed that until arguments are received by the court. And I think that the court is receiving arguments from the other side today, and will be resolved soon, so that there is clarity on this issue of whether or not fear of the virus is sufficient to entitle you to a mail-in ballot.
Sure.
And if I can interject one and add one extra thing here, you all in Texas ought to be very pleased that you actually have an attorney general who's willing to fight to defend state law, because one of the more disturbing things that you note if you look at litigation which is taking place elsewhere is that there is what amounts to a sue and settle effort going on in a number of states, in which groups on the left will challenge particular election integrity laws, and then the state will throw up its hands and allow a consent decree to be entered that effectively undermines state law. So we saw this in Minnesota, where the Minnesota Attorney General did not defend state laws banning ballot harvesting. We saw it here in Virginia, where I live, where absentee ballot protections and witness requirements were challenged in court. And again, the state did not defend them. And so now those very important and vital election integrity measures have been waived. So we're seeing some very targeted litigation in which certain attorneys general, certain states are just not vigorously defending these laws. And that's something which is particularly concerning. So Texas doesn't fall into that problem, very fortunately.
Sure.
We are indeed very fortunate to have Attorney General Ken Paxton.
So thanks, Jason and Quico, for that. This is a question for all of you, but I'll start with Chuck. Another devil's advocate question, and I'm pitching these devil's advocate questions to you gentlemen because that's what we do as a think tank, and this is a really important issue. And I want viewers of all political persuasions to have a very serious understanding of what a problem this is. So Chuck, what if devil's advocate says, okay, I agree with everything you've said up to this point in this conversation, but I think you're overstating how significant a problem is. In other words, I think you're overstating the number of times we see voter fraud of any kind. What's your response?
Well, my response is that in Texas, historically, we have seen abuse of election integrity in certain key regions and areas, often down in the Rio Grande Valley, often in certain precincts in Houston and in Dallas. However, we got some very significant statistical evidence during the 2018 election cycle that some of the vulnerabilities in the Texas election system that had heretofore been in regional areas, concentrated in certain regional areas, is now beginning to spread. And we're beginning to see statistical evidence of more widespread use or abuse of the mail-in ballot issue. Specifically, we saw increases in the number of young people claiming a disability, often near college campuses. And again, maybe there really are that many individuals under the age of 65 associated with that campus that truly are disabled. But statistically, that would probably not be the case. And so what we're beginning to see in Texas, and our concern for this election cycle, is that some of the proof of concept was worked out in the 2018 cycle. In other words, how do we exploit the loopholes in Texas more broadly across the state rather than in these regional areas that we have traditionally done this for decades? And the concern is that we haven't really done much to fix those loopholes, and our system is vulnerable to a highly contested election. And so I would say that it's a problem and it's getting worse.
Jason?
So I think that we need to remember a few key facts here. One is that mail-in ballots are inherently less secure than ballots that are cast in person. And when I was at the Heritage Foundation and we were compiling our election fraud database, it was clear from the numbers that, at least anecdotally, absentee ballot fraud is one of the most prolific forms of vote fraud in the United States. And that absentee ballot fraud can run across the gamut, whether it's ballot harvesting, which is where people will walk into people's homes and sometimes pressure them, even intimidate or coerce them into voting for particular ways. Sometimes that's tampering with or destroying absentee ballots. In the North Carolina 2018 congressional election, a Republican operative was actually responsible for tampering with or destroying several hundred ballots. And that was a sufficiently widespread fraud to taint the entire election and force a redo. And that's fairly significant. Another thing that I would point out is that even though oftentimes we hear the allegation that voter fraud is a minuscule problem that you never seem to see more than a few votes here or there. First of all, I would point out that what we're likely seeing is the tip of the iceberg. When we see voter fraud cases actually result in prosecutions and convictions, we're not seeing, the whole iceberg underwater. We're only seeing the tip of it. And secondly, we undoubtedly live in a divided political age in which elections are narrow, and the margin for victory can be 1 or 2 votes even. Just a few years ago, control of half of the Virginia state legislature was decided by drawing lots because a key race ended in a tie. And I'm sure that Quico can talk about it from his experience, where elections are narrow and people understand that. And so even a small number of fraudulent ballots can have a profound impact on elections. And that's why we have to take this very seriously.
Thanks, Jason. Quico?
Well, I want to get a little bit into history. And I think that voter fraud and stealing elections has been part of the history of the United States. And you go back to the days of Andrew Jackson, not complaining about him as his presidency, but it was known that he used to have a barrel of whiskey at every election site so that everybody'd vote for him. Then you've got, of course, Tammany Hall that existed in the East Coast of New York. They got a lot of presidents into office. And then we remember recently Mayor Daley, who used to make sure that Chicago voted for the people that Mayor Daley wanted him to vote for. You got here in Texas, you got the story of Box 13 that catapulted LBJ into the United States Senate in the 1940s, a case that still goes into history with a lot of myth and a lot of talk. But we got to remember that voter fraud has been handled by groups like recently was Acorn, and then of course you've got SEIU, which goes in with their mechanisms and goes there and turns elections one way or the other. They gather a lot of money from the left and they move that. And even though Acorn was broken up and really just splintered into many other groups. So election fraud is a reality that those on the middle or middle right have been loath to complain about because they're going to be splattered with the name of I'm suppressing the vote or it doesn't happen. And from my experience, when I complained to my handlers in Washington, D.C. About this, they said, oh, no, that doesn't exist and we're not going to go there. Well, come on, that's what happens. Every vote is the right of every citizen, and I underline that most vehemently. And every fraudulent vote is a theft of that citizen's vote and that citizen's voice. It is very, very important. The Constitution of the United States places the vote and the voting right on the states. So it is up to us in our state, as so it is in Wisconsin or New York or wherever else you may be, to formulate laws that are going to protect the citizen and that citizen's vote and voice.
Well said. Put another way, voter suppression actually comes from practices like mail-in balloting because you cannot guarantee the integrity of that ballot. And for us, every election is important. Every vote is important. That's the precise reason, the exclusive reason that we've gotten so involved in this with people who've been working on it for a long time, like Jason, that every single American deserves to be 100% certain that their vote counts. And every person's vote counts less and less the more voter fraud there is. So the more research we find, the more evidence we find of voter fraud, we know that actually is what's undermining the voters' rights. That's what's really causing suppression. So I want to soon get into questions from the audience. If you're in the audience and have a question, just go to the comments box and type it in. But before we do that, Chuck, just want to have you take us back to your old home state. You're an adopted Texan, and Texas is so happy to have you. California in 2018 made some modifications to their laws. California, of course, has been leading the charge on some of these ideas. Just want to give you a moment to sort of put into context for our viewers the problem that California continues to be on this issue.
Right. So thank you, Kevin. So California, for many, many decades, really encouraged absentee voting. You can permanently become an absentee voter in California, unlike in Texas, where you apply and it only lasts for a year. And then for many decades, the Republican Party really did the best. You had older voters who were quite diligent about voting, not only in person, but voting absentee. And what would frequently happen is on election night, the Democrat would be ahead. And as the late absentees were counted, many times the Republicans ended up winning. Well, that all changed in 2017 and 18 when two different bills passed the California legislature. And the irony was that the two bills that passed essentially mirror where Texas law used to be before 2017. In the 2017 special session, I testified in favor of tightening up Texas law to make ballot harvesting illegal. California went the other direction. It used to be in California that you could not be paid to bring in ballots from people that were not relatives of yours, that you couldn't assume the ballot in the chain of custody unless you were a close relative. California used to be that you had to be a close relative if you were going to handle that ballot and then bring it in to the election officials or to the US Postal Service. Now anyone can, and they can get paid for it. And so what ended up happening is a tremendous amount of money got dumped into the system. One party was prepared to exploit the new changes, and they went in and made full use of the more expanded provisions. And what they would do is go door to door, targeting young voters that had been signed up through the Federal Motor Voter Act, through the Department of Motor Vehicles, people who had never voted before, 19, 20 years old. And maybe their parents were staunch Republicans or Democrats and voted all the time, but the kid hadn't before. And so they'd knock on the door and they would pester that person into giving up their absentee ballot to that ballot harvester, who would then get paid for it and bring it in. And what ended up happening in the 2018 cycle is you had far greater losses than would have been anticipated in the typical off-year election of the party in power in the White House. There was a wipeout in the state assembly, the state senate, and Congress. So one last interesting postscript, there was a special election last week in California, actually a couple of them for state senate and for Congress. And the Republicans won both of those seats. And so I think what's beginning to happen now is the Republican Party in California is learning how to adapt to the new rules. It's going to be very costly for them. And of course, a potential advantage would go to people who are willing to cheat or exploit the loopholes. But no advantage in politics is forever.
That is true. You and Quico know that well. So Jason, last question before we get to some audience questions. And that is, let's just assume, God forbid, for the moment that activists and politicians, or certain activists and politicians, get their wish. We have this expansion of mail-in balloting, either through legislation or litigation. Walk us through, I hesitate to use the word hypothetical because it seems so real that this is going to happen in some states, but walk us through that scenario so that we can tie in a really neat bow all of these good points you've made for our viewers, for them to understand what the day after our national election day in November looks like.
Well, what an election would look like if either through legislation or litigation, as you point out, we wind up in an automatic and mandatory vote by mail election. It's not going to be pretty. And where we might be when we wake up the day after election day in November is that we do not know who has won the presidency. We do not know who has won the Senate or House races or any of the other innumerable down ballot races. And the reason is that absentee balloting, one, takes time to process, considerably longer than voting in person does. And secondly, there is a push right now to extend the deadlines for receipt of absentee ballots. So we saw this in Wisconsin. We see this being an issue in litigation all over the place, where right now there is a push that any ballot which is postmarked by election day ought to be accepted. So you're looking at potentially ballots coming in 2, 3, 4 days after the election or later, and then being processed. In Wisconsin, it took a full 7 days before the counting began. And results took a little bit longer even than that before we actually saw who would carry the day. So where we might be the day after election day is, one, we don't know who's won. Two, we might see a torrent of litigation because of concern about ballot counting practices. And we see this very frequently on the left, where they will bring lawsuits to keep polling places open, for instance. Well, we would expect to see much the same about how you count absentee ballots. We saw this in Florida in 2018 with the key Senate and governor races there. And we could see this anywhere that the margin of victory is such that a lawsuit that changes the rules at the last second for which ballots are counted could result in a victory for the left. We could expect to see a lawsuit there. And so we'll be potentially looking at a situation in which weeks or more of very partisan and vitriolic litigation could be proceeding all over the country. And that could be the way that we find out who won the White House. Now, it's a quaint notion, but I believe that voters and not lawyers should be determining who goes to the White House. And so what I would like to see is that we avoid a lot of these problems. And then the last thing that I'll point out is that anyone who is concerned about whether or not we are dramatizing this issue or blowing it out of proportion should look at Nevada and New Jersey, because New Jersey's already had a vote by mail race, and Nevada is proceeding towards one in Clark County, where they are sending ballots out now, not only to active voters, but also to inactive voters. And what we're seeing in common in both of these places is that a large number of absentee votes by mail are being left behind by postal workers in lobbies of apartment buildings or even on the sidewalk, because they don't have accurate, up-to-date voter rolls. And so when the postal worker shows up at a building and discovers that the voter who's supposed to be there doesn't live there, they don't bring the ballots back, they just leave them behind. We also saw that there is an emerging scandal in one town in New Jersey where hundreds of ballots have been disqualified because they were found illegally bundled, and that's evidence of ballot harvesting and contravention of state law. So that's a concern. Now, if we extrapolate what that looks like nationwide, we can expect hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of ballots to be going to the wrong place, intending to reach one voter but never reaching them, going to the wrong address, going out of the names of deceased voters or voters who are ineligible to vote in a particular state, because there are so many inaccuracies on our voter rolls and states are not cleaning them up. And that raises the specter for fraud on a massive level. And at the most basic level, it raises practical concerns, since you can't prove chain of custody with ballots or anything else. And so I think that, as we head towards the November election, we need to be very careful that we do not overreact to the problems of the virus and wind up creating unnecessary problems for our election, because the credibility of our elections is at stake. And whether it's through voter fraud, through practical concerns, through the potential for the new processes and procedures that would really be rushed slapdash style into effect of those processes failing, or whether it's litigation on an unprecedented scale, I think voters could walk away from November not certain who actually won an election and not certain whether the results can be trusted. And that, no matter whether you are a Republican or a Democrat, is not, I think, something that we want to see. It would certainly not be healthy for American democracy.
You're not helping me sleep better at night. And in fact, I might contribute to that that problem for our viewers, because I just want to draw a real precise image. You talked about those ballots in New Jersey being bundled. They literally were bundled by a rubber band. I mean, this is what we're facing with ballot harvesting. And as our research has shown, we've got a lot of this on our website. This is a significant problem in Texas, not just in the Rio Grande Valley. We've seen it in Harris County. We've seen it in Tarrant County. This is a problem probably up and down the Interstate 35 corridor in Texas, where a big percentage of the population of Texas lives. So, gentlemen, we're now going to pivot into some audience questions and have a couple of really good ones thus far. The first one is, how can secure chain of custody be protected? Quico, would you like to start?
Well, secure chain of custody needs to be beefed up at the legislative level.
And explain what chain of custody is for our
Well, in
viewers.
other words, from the voter to the officer in charge of the ballot, rather than going through a third party. And in Texas, you put it in the mail and you entrust it to the United States Postal Service, where it trades many, many hands before it lands into the hands of the election office in the county. So chain of custody is just that. It's who handles it and who unknowingly handles it from, let's say that you got your mother-in-law at an old folks home. Who handles it from her to get to the mailbox, and how many people touch it between the time that mother-in-law signs it and it gets put into the mail. And that also complicates things, and that's where a lot of that fraud seeps in. So that's how I would explain the chain of custody.
Thank you. Chuck, any indications from your research in particular here in Texas or in other states that this issue of chain of custody is a problem?
Well, I certainly think it is when you see the results in California in 2018. Now, again, it's important to note that California legalized ballot harvesting. They made legal what I view as a very unethical procedure. In other words, compensating people for the ballots that they're able to bring in, encouraging activity where people who are not a relative basically harangue somebody into giving up a vote and then bank it with that campaign. So yeah, it's a growing problem. And I think it's very important for people to appreciate that the vote is sacred, that the vote is your vote, and you shouldn't be intimidated or coerced into voting for somebody that you're not interested in voting for. And that's the challenge with mail-in balloting in many cases, is that you have third parties that get in between the voter and the ballot itself, pressure that person, or in some cases, as you saw, as was mentioned by, I think it was Jason in North Carolina, where a Republican had their victory voided because they contracted with people who were, in this case, destroying ballots, presumably ballots that didn't go the right way, that they were getting rid of. And so I think it's very important for people to understand that mail-in balloting is less than optimal. It's not as secure as going directly to the polls. And if you have a challenge getting to the polls, if you're a military personnel or you're a college student out of town, then of course it's your only way of voting. But otherwise, it's far more appropriate, far better to show up and vote in person.
I would second that. Look, for some people, there is a reliance on mail-in balloting, and we certainly want to have that option, particularly for elderly folks or for infirm individuals, to be able to vote and to be able to request an absentee ballot, and even to get assistance with filling out that ballot if they need it. But what we're talking about here is something which not even that long ago was just a commonly accepted bipartisan concern, and that is that vote by mail is more vulnerable, more susceptible to voter fraud than in-person voting. And so we need to be establishing at the most basic level common sense protections that recognize the problem and guard against it. And for those of you who might be thinking that I'm making this up, in 2005, there was a bipartisan national committee that was co-chaired by President Jimmy Carter. And from that report, I'll read it here. Citizens who vote at home, at nursing homes, at the workplace, or in church are more susceptible to pressure, overt or subtle, or to intimidation. And that's after a lengthy passage talking about other vulnerabilities in absentee balloting and the problems of ballot harvesting. And the recommendation is that ballot harvesting be made illegal across the entire nation. That's Jimmy Carter, Democratic former president. So we've come a long way where this issue has unfortunately been politicized and polarized. And I think that a lot of that is a calculation designed to lock in certain individuals and prevent them from even thinking about the issue of election integrity is what it is, which is a common sense, nonpartisan thing. But this at the end of the day, as Chuck was just saying, is about protecting voters, ensuring that they're not going to be disenfranchised or subject to to intimidation or pressure, or really lose their right to vote because we are taking away protections that are common sense. And that, unfortunately, is an objective of a number of these groups, including the Democratic Party itself, when they're suing to take away bans on ballot harvesting, when they're suing to invalidate voter identification laws, when they are suing to prevent states from doing signature matching and checking on ballots. And so we're looking at a situation in which a large number of ballots are going to go out. We don't have effective chain of custody. We can't flag ballots that might be fraudulent. And we're legalizing ballot harvesting, which is the #1 means to lead to widespread fraud. That's not a great place to be.
Thanks, Jason. Quico, I'll ask you the next question from one of our viewers, which is, how can you be sure that the ballot boxes will ensure the integrity of voting? I take that question to mean not just literally ballot boxes, but the machines themselves. There have been a lot of concerns expressed about the machines, whether it be the software or just the physical integrity of them. Would you speak to that concern?
There are a lot of concerns about the software that handles it. And I think that in some counties, you're also going into a dual system where you write out your ballot, you print it out, and you put it into a machine that counts it. There are a lot of software mechanisms out there that, for instance, Dallas County has a lot of complaints about the software that they use that was created out of the country, and who handles it and who analyzes that. That's really on the shoulders of the election administrators, on making sure that the vote is counted correctly and without any kind of hitch, and also that the integrity of the software that they use is such that there is no opportunity for it to cough up something that is wrong or not correct. That's another way that ballots are tampered with and done. So the security of it is going to have to depend on some sort of a board that has gone and tested the software so that it can prove up the correct ballot count. But there's something else that if you would permit me just to address here, because we've talked a lot about mail-in ballots and ballot security and the rights of everybody to vote. But another thing that is very germane to vote harvesting and also to fraud in the election is the registration process. And people don't talk about that as often, but that in my experience is the root of a lot of that fraudulent activity, where people go out there and without a care in the world, they're going to sign up anybody that has two legs. And it doesn't matter whether they're citizens or non-citizens, or even residents or non-residents. And it's a very dangerous process, because then that gets imprinted into the voting rolls, from which you go out there and you start doing your illicit activity, if you've got enough of them that you've signed up and you know who they are and the names that they are.
Thanks, Quico. Well, gentlemen, we're down to just a few minutes remaining, and there are some other audience questions in the queue. I'm sorry we're not going to be able to get to each of those, but obviously you know how to contact us if you have some remaining questions. What I want to do is pitch to each of you for some closing comments, a minute or two each, gentlemen. But as I try to do with each of these weekly primers, leave us with some encouragement, leave us with some hope. You know, it's a hallmark of the Texas Public Policy Foundation that we not only want to diagnose the problem in total truthfulness, however pretty or ugly that truth is, but we want to leave our friends, we want to leave our viewers the sense of what they can do to be part of the solution to that problem. Jason, we'll start with you.
Well, I definitely like the idea of ending on an optimistic note, because when we're talking about this issue, it can get dour pretty quickly. I will say that particularly in the last couple of weeks, there has been some good news that came out of Wisconsin, for instance. What we saw was that data, which has been analyzed by health experts, showed that the precautions that were taken for in-person voting in Wisconsin allowed the state to safely handle that electoral process without seeing a spike in COVID cases. And so that's fantastic news, because that means that the worst case scenario, that if any group of people turn out and vote in an election, it's automatically going to lead to another spike in coronavirus. That's not likely to happen, as long as states are taking the adequate safety precautions, social distancing, PPE, and so on. It proves that that can be done. And so I think that states should be looking very carefully at that as they design their contingency plans. And the reason that that's good news is that it allows you then to do a much smarter, or take a much smarter approach to adapting and accommodating the health crisis in the electoral process. It allows you to minimize the number of changes, because one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that elections are complicated, and the more that we change, the more opportunities for things to go awry that we cause, because if we're trying to do this on short notice, then there's not going to be adequate time for testing, there's not going to be adequate time for training. And so we need to avoid sweeping changes, because that opens a Pandora's box of problems. This means that we can actually effectively run an election with a minimum of changes that are targeted and temporary and maximize the odds of success. And the other thing that I'll point out is that despite the fact that right now there is a significant amount of money which is being funneled to push litigation and push advocacy, all designed to move the country to vote by mail and insist that anyone who disagrees with that is engaged in vote suppression. We've done polling at my group, the Honest Elections Project, that points out that on a whole host of issues, from voter identification to voters going to the polls on election day, to list maintenance procedures, that Americans, including people on the center left, are in favor of fair elections, free elections, elections that are secured by basic common sense proposals. So no matter what the noise is that we're hearing, or really the noise level might be, most Americans still agree that elections should be protected, that they deserve to be protected, and that the protections that we're talking about today are not controversial. And so that gives me hope that eventually the American people will see through the facade of partisanship and will understand what's going on, and will resist that effort. And that means, I think, there's still a sense of what it means to be a democracy, and that hasn't been lost yet.
Thanks, Jason, so much, and thanks for joining us. Chuck.
Well, I have some words of optimism and hope, and that's that Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton has really engaged on this issue. And what you're seeing out of the Attorney General's office is increased resources, increased prosecutorial and investigative resources to try to tamp down on widespread election fraud. This is a big deal, because if you're a young member of the Attorney General's staff, I mean, you really want to go after violent crime and Mexican cartels and things like that. And the fact that they've been able to get serious about this and get some really top-notch people in charge of this issue, I think bodes very well for election integrity in Texas. And I think that as a Texan, we can all be proud of this effort out of the Attorney General's office to enhance and to ensure the integrity of elections in the Lone Star State.
Thanks, Chuck. And last words, Quico.
Well, I'll try to be brief, but I want to really strike a very nonpartisan and optimistic point. And that is that voters should understand their rights and the rules of voting. They should be free to choose. The voting systems should preserve the integrity of each ballot. And we must ensure that every citizen's basic democratic right to vote is protected from intentional fraud and inefficient bureaucracy. And as a fundamental feature of keeping our public officials accountable and our society free, our voting rights must be defended vigilantly. And I want to say, just like at the end of the day, we close the door to our shops and turn on our security mechanisms. And when we go home to sleep at night, we lock the doors and make sure that our children are safe in bed and that our house is secure. We must remember that it is the responsibility of every citizen to be vigilant, because eternal vigilance is the price of freedom.
Amen, Quico. It's so good to hear you make those points so eloquently. The reason that the Texas Public Policy Foundation has joined the great patriots in this fight, like Jason Snead at the Honest Elections Project, is not just because intrinsically this is a problem that needs to be fixed. It's that if we don't get elections right in this country, we don't get elections right in this state, all of the other policy work we do should just be thrown out the window, because it transcends honest elections. That concept, that goal transcends everything we're trying to do. It transcends every political party, every era, every intellectual movement. It is the hallmark of what designates a free people. And because this problem has become so politicized, that is why this nonpartisan group, the Texas Public Policy Foundation, has gotten engaged so that we can depoliticize it for the sake of every single ballot, every single voter, every single election. Thank you, the three of you, for being with us. Chuck DeVore, Jason Snead, Quico, Canseco, you did a great job. I really appreciate all the work that you're doing. And folks, for those of you who've joined to view this, thanks so much for taking some time. If you have additional questions, even after this is concluded, you can enter them in the comments box, and our wonderful communication staff will get those to us. May God keep you, may he bless you, and may he continue to bless Texas. Thank you.